Welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Shministim. This is the topic for today, and we have two young ladies from Israel, Palestine, who would be helping us to understand what that means and why they are in such an organization. And so welcome, Maya Wind, Netta, Mishly. So could you tell us, Maya, about yourself and first what that Shministim means and how you are involved in it?
So Shministim is, in Hebrew it means 12th grader, and that's what we are. We are a group of 12th graders who refused at the end of our high school to serve in the military because we oppose the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And so we are actually called the Shministim letter because we got together, we were a group of 10 of us this year in 2008, and we wrote a letter to our government, to the Chief of Staff, to the Minister of Defense, and we also circulated the letter widely, and we got signatures from 200 teenagers throughout Israel supporting us. And then each of us, instead of going to the army, in the day of our draft, we went to jail. And in the letter, of course, we wrote why we refuse and why we oppose the occupation, why it's wrong.
Yeah, very good. And Netta, could you tell us something more about you and also about Shministim?
It's important to mention that our group is a very small group in Israel, unfortunately. We were about 10 people who were sent to jail this year. Except for being a political organization, we're also some sort of support group to each other, since it's a very hard position in Israel to be a draft refusnik. So every time when someone went to jail, we were all there supporting. We came in with drums and shouting and, helping each other. And when someone was in jail, we gathered outside the prison to yell and demonstrate outside so they can hear us and know that we're behind them. Personally, I spent 20 days in military jail and another week in military detention. And that's it.
Yeah, well, good. But so you're not any kind of Shministim, right? You're a special kind, those who were conscientious objectors in that.
We chose this name because the high school senior year, like in the US, you spend a lot of effort in doing stuff to go into a good college. In Israel, when you're a 12th grader and you're a senior high school, you put a lot of effort of getting a good job in the army, going to a good unit, and we thought it's an important thing to emphasize that it is your 12th grade, and this is when you have to make the decision.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, as 12th graders, or even before as 10th or 11th graders, I don't think like it just dawned on you that, oh, I don't want to go to the army, right? So what prepared you to take such an action, Maya?
I think each of us individually had really different stories. For me personally, I grew up in Jerusalem, and I went to a religious school, and about half of my classmates were settlers from the West Bank, many of them from extremist settlements, and a lot of very right-wing people. So I grew up in quite a right-wing environment in school, and the change actually began for me in the Second Intifada, and it was terrifying living in Jerusalem at the time, of course, all of the bombings, etc. And it got me to start asking questions: why is this happening? What is behind it? And I realized I didn't know anything really. I didn't read the papers. I didn't understand what all of this conflict was about. So I started to read, and I started to ask myself questions. And then when I was 15, I joined a dialogue group for Palestinians and Israelis from Jerusalem. And it was a conversation with a Palestinian girl that I met through this group that really was the initial sort of burst of my bubble. And it really made me start to realize that the army was not a defense army, and that we did immoral things. And then I started becoming a peace activist in the West Bank, and when I saw the West Bank and what was happening there from the Palestinian side, not from the settlement side. I'd visited settlements as a child, but when I'd been to the Palestinian parts of the West Bank, I realized that the occupation was immoral and that I could not possibly serve it.
So you looked at the situation in terms of Zionism, as Edward Said puts it, from the victim's point of view. Zionism from the point of view of its victims. So you had both experiences, you know, settlers or colonialist experiences and Palestinian experiences as well. So that is wonderful. But what I'm thinking is that how come you went to jail for 20 days and like 1 week in detention, and you had multiple 20 days in jail, or 2 or
well,
3?
the way it works, the process that Shministim go through is we go to the military base, and after our draft date passes, we are considered soldiers even if we are not soldiers. And so we get trialed for refusing an order. Refusing an order to become a soldier, but it's still refusing an order, and we are judged as soldiers, and we are sent to military prison. And so after this, whatever amount of time we spend there, it's anywhere between 7 to 35 days. We come out, we get sent back to the induction base, and then they say, okay, you've learned your lesson, now will you serve? And then we say no again, and we get sent back to jail. And this process repeats itself for different people. It's different amounts of time. I spent 2 months in detention, 42 days in jail. And then eventually all of us, all the members of the Shministim group, got released on mental health. We all were deemed mentally unfit to serve in the army, and therefore were released.
Because you are sane.
Yes, we are clearly insane. Yeah.
No, because you are sane. That's
right.
why.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. So that's you know, an interesting thing. Like you go only for 20 days and then 1 week in detention and all that. But that explains it. You know, what are some of the activities and events that you have participated in, Netta, before that and maybe after?
When I was 15, I started going to demonstrations against the wall in Ibrahim and Yalin villages. Yalin is pretty soon, like a year ago, but Ibrahim, I started going there when I was 15. It was one of the most famous villages, I think, now, because of the struggle against the wall, which the wall there, the High Court, the Israeli High Court already decided it's illegal there, but it's still there, and no one moves it, which is... So I started going there, lots, like I would go there instead of school, don't tell my teachers. And that really changed me and made me more active inside Israel and in the West Bank, because I felt, you know, I saw the Israeli soldiers shooting at me, shooting at innocent Palestinian people or innocent... Everyone who was there was actually innocent, because they were all struggling for their own land, which was stolen. And seeing this brutal violence against citizens, against people like me, like everyone I know inside Israel, only with less luck, was horrible for me. And it's really, like Maya said, birthed my bubble. Like, I couldn't imagine that soldiers, that I was raised to be one of them, are doing this kind of thing in my name.
Yeah. So it was easier then for you, I mean, to go to jail rather than participate in such violent acts against the population. So it was easier because somebody said, well, it could have been easier for you just to join the army. Yeah. So,
well, I don't know. I don't want to compare. I think being a soldier is also very difficult, and I think I don't wish the experience of being a soldier on anyone. I don't think anyone should be a soldier. Any human being shouldn't be put in that situation. But for me, I think, I mean, socially it was more difficult to go to jail as opposed to go to the army because it's much more accepted. And doing this was going against everyone, because everyone in Israel was or is a soldier at some point. So to criticize being a soldier or to criticize the occupation is in a way criticizing everyone else, everyone in my society. And so people get defensive when we talk about it, because they feel like we are attacking them personally as opposed to a policy.
Yeah, so that's good. So it's just because of your conscience as well. Yeah, I mean, your conscience did not allow you to do that which is permissible to do in terms of Israeli society. Yeah. Well, you also work with some organizations over there, right? So could you tell us something about those organizations that you've been working with?
Well, I work with two main organizations. One of them is Rabbis for Human Rights. In this organization, I work a lot in East Jerusalem. Right now, there's settlement expansion all the time there, and we're trying to work against that. And we also are trying to provide Palestinians with the basic humanitarian needs and that they deserve to make sure that their humanitarian needs are met. So we often go to harvest olives with them, or to help shepherds go with their herds, because a lot of times either soldiers or settlers, violent settlers, attack them. So we are there to protect them and help make sure that they can do what they need to do without being hurt. And we try to provide water sometimes when the Israeli government or the civil administration do not allow water to get to some villages. And we try to do sort of humanitarian work. And I also work with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. It's a very different kind of work. There I'm a tour guide, and I guide political tours in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And we try to show, first of all, we try to expose people to the phenomenon of house demolitions as a way to remove Palestinians from the city, to cleanse the area of Palestinians. And we try to reframe the political discourse about it, and we try to expose Israel's policies and what Israel is doing. So it's talking peace sometimes on one hand, but it's building settlements and destroying Palestinian homes on the other. So we're trying to show that contradiction.
Yeah, good. We'll come back to those two organizations. I want to ask you a few more questions about that, but I want to go to Netta now and see what kind of organizations you've been working with and give us some idea about them.
Personally, I do less work with organizations. I don't work for any of them. It's more of like a volunteer work. One of the organizations that I like the most is Anarchists Against the Wall, which is, I think, a wonderful organization that do lots of political work with Palestinians. I think that the way it builds, it's a very, very non-hierarchic organization that do actually work with Palestinians. The way it works is that the popular committee in villages, in Palestinian villages, contacts the anarchists because they already know the works that we do, and then we join them to their demonstration, their struggle in solidarity. And I think it's a really wonderful way of working, because I don't think that it should be the Palestinians join our struggle, like inside the Israeli society. We join their struggle. I think that more than that, I do some education work. I was involved in a big project that's called the Alternative Summer Camp. We do summer camps for high school or even younger youth in Israel. We invite them to a camp that gives more political knowledge. We talk a lot about the wall and about all kinds of stuff that connected to the occupation and other stuff, also ecological and other subjects that people are interested in.
Very good. That leads me to ask you another question in terms about the youth, Israeli youth. By and large, in general, they're socialized in a certain way that you were able to get out of, extract yourselves out of that. So could you tell us something about that socialization process so that they can accept like Israel as Israel portrays itself to be, and some of the things you, in terms of your education of those youth, how you counter those kinds of myths?
First of all, I think that the first thing that every Israeli kid learns is that we came to an empty place. There was nothing. We came to to the desert and we made the desert bloom, and our grandparents came here and no one was here. And this is something that is really deep into our education, and very hard to contradict, because when people don't acknowledge the fact that they were Palestinian here before we came, then everything else is kind of, you need to learn the history so you can argue with the facts now, because otherwise you can justify anything. Second, I think that we all learn how the word hates us. Everyone hates the Jews. Without Israel, we will all be refugees all over the world, and every time something bad will happen, everyone will kill and blame the Jews. And this is another thing that I think that we should learn, that it's not true. Jews are successful all over the place. I mean, it's not like people are still in camps. It's not like people are still being sent to concentration camps or going through the Holocaust every day. And the Holocaust was an important chapter in the history, and it's important to remember it. But Naomi Klein said it I don't remember when she said it exactly, but she said you can learn two lessons from the Holocaust. You can learn that it can never happen again, and you can learn that it can never happen again to Jews. And I think that the lesson that it can never happen again is much more important, because it's a universal thing, and it's a matter of morality. I think we should all learn that. Maya, do you want to extend?
You want to say more about that, and in
Yeah, I
terms
think-
of the education and the youth?
Yeah, so I think, like Netta said, from the beginning, in the way that we are taught history, the Palestinian narrative is clearly absent. So that really, like Netta said, frames the way we see everything that is happening now. And also, I think most Israelis genuinely believe that the Israeli army is a defense force, a force protecting us. We don't see it as if we conquered another people or another land. We see it as, everything we are doing is just defense. People are attacking us, and we are responding, and that is all we are doing. It's sort of in a very passive way, almost. We don't see ourselves as aggressors or as offenders. And we also feel like as if all these wars are forced upon us. We don't choose war. We don't choose to live by the sword. It's just that all the Arabs around us and the Palestinians hate us, and that's why we are forced to do this. And in this way, Israelis are sort of not taking responsibility for what's happening. And that's a big problem. Because if you're the victim and if you are only defending yourself, you aren't held accountable for your actions.
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, a number of Arab writers, intellectuals have written about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, etc., but their voices were not heard. It came to the revisionist historians, some of them, including Ilan Pappé, with his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which he published in 2006. Confirming a lot of things that the Arab writers, intellectuals have said before, but also drawing on Israeli military archives and other Zionist archives before Israel came to power, became a state. And he exposed all that. So in terms of educating yourselves about all these things, because it appears to me clearly that you have been educating yourselves throughout, have you, did you see or observe how narratives like Ilan Pappé's are received in Israel? Are they denied? Are they said that they are lies? Well, how is it received?
I think writers like Ilan Pappé and the like are totally, if they're not ignored, then they're disqualified through calling them, sort of pathologizing them, either if they're not Jewish, saying they're anti-Semitic, and if they are Jewish, saying that they are self-hating Jews. That's often what we are called, self-hating Jews. That's the only way that people seem to be able to explain what we have to say. So I think they're always disproved or disqualified in some absurd way. and they're certainly not part of the mainstream discourse about the conflict. And that's the main point, is that a lot of people don't hear of Ilan Pappé, and if they do, they just know him as an Israel hater, and that's all there is to it. They don't bother reading his books for themselves to find out what he has to say.
Yeah, that's a problem. There are other, of course, writers, revisionist writers, historians, etc. One of them was agreeing with Pape that this cleansing happened, but it wasn't like a planned thing. Benny Morris, for instance, he was saying that that wasn't a plan, it was just like haphazard kind of stuff, but he came to the conclusion that we should have even kicked out more Palestinians than we had already in 1948, which leads me to think that actually this is a really offensive thing in terms of from a humanist position. This is offensive for someone to say we should have kicked out more people, we should have ethnic cleansed more people. Do any people in Israel know that there are like 400 or 500 villages, Palestinian villages that were wiped out, or some people like living in it or next to it, etc.?
I think most of the people don't know.
Don't know.
Yes.
You
I think there is a problem of education here. The word Nakba, which people outside of Israel and of course the Palestinian know, Israelis don't know even what the word means. And it's and I think we don't know it on purpose. There are people who want that we won't know them.
Right.
This word.
Yeah, because you think like, wow, 400 or 500 villages. You think like Israel just as big as Africa is, and not a little place where like you could on excursions you might happen on one of those villages maybe or something. I don't know. I've never been to Palestine after Israel was created in 1948, at least the part that up to 67 where Israel was created. But it seems to me that how can you miss those villages, or why wouldn't the teacher tell you about them or somebody else?
Well, I think it's not about missing the villages. I mean, sometimes Israelis could go and visually see what was a Palestinian village, but it's also about explaining, sort of giving an explanation or a justification for it. As far as most Israelis are concerned, again, 48 was just an act of self-defense. Palestinians and the rest of the Arab countries around us attacked the Jews. The Jews were defending themselves, and that's that's sort of explained in that way. And so, again, everything can be justified within the Israeli framework, within the Israeli narrative.
Right. Yeah. No, so I was thinking, like, of course, the conqueror is writing history, and erasing not only people but their narratives. So that's really kind of interesting. It seems to me. In terms of the myth that all the Arabs were descending upon these Zionist forces to try and kick the Jews out to the sea or all that kind of stuff, there's this writer, Israeli writer, Uri Bar Joseph. I don't know if you know of him, who wrote the book, 1992 book or something called The Best of Enemies, and he writes about the relationship between the Zionist forces and later on Israel, and then King Abdullah I of Jordan, and all the machinations and the conspiracies and the agreements and all that kind of stuff that went before them to divide the lands between them. So that shows that at least Abdullah of Jordan didn't really choose to fight with the Zionists and Israel until they wanted to take more stuff from him, which was East Jerusalem. So he fought to prevent them from taking East Jerusalem because they reneged on a promise or on some agreement. So there are those books and that kind of research available, and I don't know about the teachers in Israel. I mean, they're just completely also brainwashed themselves, it seems to me, so they don't do that.
Very
simplistic
way to see it, I think, because Israel is not the first state that they occupied. We didn't invent an occupation.
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
And if you want to see what's going on in Israel, then think about every state. The U.S., do you have a whole education about what happened with the Native
Indigenous people.
Americans here? How much do you learn about slavery? I mean, every state has their black, spots and or the stuff that we don't want to remember. So yeah, we do it and it's wrong. And I think this is our job and this is what we're doing to try to educate people. And I don't think that every person in Israel is a bad person or an evil monster or anything, but there is a really, really strong system of justification, and it's bad. And this is what we're fighting for. We want to say there is no way to justify the occupation. There is no way to justify refugee camps. No way. And I think this is what we're trying to do. This is why we're here. We want to tell a real story. We are now, at least the way I feel, I'm now using my privilege as a Jewish, as a white person, that people are listening to more and give me more stage to tell a story of the Palestinians or the story of the occupation.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you on that, because occupation wasn't created by the Zionist forces, of course, because as you mentioned, we had the Spanish come to the New World, so to speak, and wipe out a lot of native peoples, right? The United States and wiping out of the native peoples and slavery, etc. All these things you said, like more recently South Africa, for instance, yeah. So we have that, but these are the kinds of things that the people in the respective area have who know what's going on and who have educated themselves, have the kind of duty to do that kind of educating. Of course, people are, most of the people are nice and all that kind of stuff, but when they are beguiled and they are like lied to, etc., they take a certain path that would be in the interest of the powers that be, and socialized in that way. So they act those things out when they are in a position that is structurally created for them, like the Israeli armed forces. I don't call them defense forces. Armed forces.
Neither do we.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why. And then they go to the West Bank or to Gaza and, they unleash their terror, horror, and all that on the Palestinians. It's not that they are bad people individually necessarily, although some might be, but that's what they've been fed, and they're trying to defend themselves, quote unquote, yeah. So, but that's the thing, we gotta try and figure out a way how to this thing, and that's where you come in here, and I'm happy that you are touring the United States and educating a lot of people, about that. I have this website for your tour. It's called www.whywerefuse.org. So we're gonna, it's right up there. So you want to say something about that website and the places you've been to so far and the places you want to go to?
Well,
so I have your a few photos of you, nice photos, you too, and then at UC Berkeley, and then with Cynthia McKinney. Could you say something about that and about the tour at large?
Well, so far we've only been to San Francisco area and Seattle, but we're going also to LA and Tucson here, and then to the East Coast. What we're trying to do with this tour really is not only to give information that's not available in mainstream discourse regarding the occupation in Israel-Palestine, but we're also trying to create a global movement of support, not only for the liberation of Palestine, but also against occupation and racism anywhere that it is, because it exists here in the United States, it exists in many countries. And we are trying to highlight this And we hope that also Americans will come to understand that they have an active role, a very active role that they are playing in the Israeli occupation. Israel couldn't be doing this alone. The U.S. is supporting us by giving us $3 billion a year in military aid without any conditions, such as compliance with international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, etc. And also in terms of the products that people here buy. They buy products from companies, not only Israeli, also international or multinational, that are profiting from the occupation. And it's also an economic thing. There are economic interests that are helping to keep Israel in Palestine. And so there are many ways to work against this, and one of them is through economic activism, getting Americans to feel responsible and get involved, and to stop buying from these kind of companies.
That's very good. I just wanna. I went on this site and looked at, clicked on upcoming events. So just like to say something about that, it's not very clear there, but you'll be in what is it? The 21st today, University of Hawaii, University of Arizona on the 22nd, Tucson on the 23rd. Then LA and Southern California and all the way till October 11th, 9th to 11th at Georgetown University and Howard University. Okay, so these are a lot of activities. People who want to know more about your tour and so on should go to whywewrefuse.org and see that. It's interesting, like in terms of, you said, the liberation of Palestine, which is from an Israeli, might be, of course, is a no-no, right? But you were not hesitant to say that. Could you, like Edward Said once said that Israeli Jews and Palestinians are two sides of the same coin. So one cannot find their future without the other. And if you want to, if the Israelis wipe out or ethnic cleanse more Palestinians, then by that logic, their future would be, would evaporate, would be wiped out. So could you say something about that in terms of liberation of Palestine? Does it also mean liberating Jews in Israel from the myths that they are under, or at least most of them are under? Something?
Definitely, and it's not just about the myths. I think Netta and I both have very strong positions about how the occupation is harming Israeli society. We also refute as feminists, as women. I think the fact that Israel is so militaristic has very negative effects for women's status. It's also increasing racism in the country, not only towards Arabs or Palestinians, but towards all minorities that are not Jewish. Also economically, and also in terms of the public debate, issues like healthcare, like the welfare system, like education get pushed aside. Everyone's always talking about security. All of these things are very harmful for Israeli society.
Netta, you want to say something? Because Maya was talking about like racism not only against Palestinians but others. You're working with African refugees. So could you say more?
I think Islamophobia, as we call it, is really affecting the status of refugees, African refugees who comes through Egypt to Israel. There was a big deportation plan to deport people from the area of Tel Aviv, which is the most center area of Israel, and where refugees can get most of their help, and most of the organization that helps them are in Tel Aviv. There was a plan to deport them south and north from Tel Aviv and deny their right to be in the area where they can get help. And you could see lots of graffiti, for example, saying throw those Muslim Negroes away and deport them from Israel. And I think it's really the fact that Israelis are so scared of Muslims and so scared of Arabs. It's ridiculous because most of them are just ignorant, and it's sad.
Yeah, that's why when they go into the army, some of them try to act out that fear by saying we're bigger than you now, we're more powerful, we have the guns, we can do whatever to you. Actually, that's why do these African refugees go there? I mean,
lots of them are going to Egypt, and the situation is Egypt is not, it's worse, almost worse than Israel. Lots of them are being deported back from Egypt to Sudan or to Darfur or to Eritrea, all those countries, and they get killed there. In Egypt itself, there's lots of racism. Lots of people are just trying to run away from wherever they are to wherever they can to create a better future for themselves.
So, humanist point of view says, well, borders? What borders? Should you have, open movement, free movement of people, not only of capital, and business people, etc., but and commodities, etc. It has to be also freedom of movement for labor and human beings, So that's
it's also a personal story. My
yeah.
family, at least quarter of them, are Holocaust survivors. And when they tried to go to other places, the borders were closed and they told them no. And the Jewish community is, until today, screaming about it. How could you tell no to people who wanted to save themselves and go into your country? And now Israel is acting exactly the same. And I think this is disgraceful.
Yeah, that's not a humanist position. Okay, you gotta be not exclusivist, like only Jews only, for Jews only, because we have this thing for blacks, for whites, right? Yeah, or no, Indians allowed or something like that. Yeah. So here we have acting out that which has been acted out against you in an earlier period of time. When will we ever learn? That is the rhetorical question. You mentioned, Maya, about the boycott, the divestment. You didn't necessarily mention it in this manner, and the sanctions. And I have here this website called whoprofits.org.
It's a wonderful website.
Yeah, could you tell us more about that and about the website as well?
Well, the website is actually made by the Women's Coalition for Peace in Israel. It's an Israeli organization, actually Israeli and Palestinian. There are Palestinian women working there also, but it's all women. It's a wonderful organization, and they came up with this website in order to try and help educate people not only in Israel but also abroad about these companies that I mentioned before that are profiting from the occupation in any number of ways. If they're exploiting Palestinian labor, because the civil administration has very lax labor laws, and they're exploiting Palestinian labor, or Palestinian products, or Palestinian natural resources that Israel and companies from abroad are stealing from Palestine because no one is there to stop them. All of these ways of exploiting Palestinian resources and goods and all of these companies are listed on this website. It's a wonderful website for people to use to educate themselves and be better educated consumers.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, because here we have in the worldwide now there is this called BDS movement, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And it's in Europe, it's in the United Kingdom, it's in the United States. A number of churches beginning to take positions on that. In fact, the latest was from the United Kingdom, the Firemen Association of the United Kingdom came out for divestment from Israel and for sanctions and boycott and all that kind of stuff. So this is like something beginning to happen. That is working, of course, against Zionist people who believe in Zionism in terms of ideology or as a political movement. And that is counterproductive to Israeli diplomatic gains and political gains, etc. So this is spreading like as it should be. So I just clicked on the settlement industry button on whoprofits.org, and it tells you a lot about the settlement industry. Could you, Netta, say something about that?
Well, First of all, I think the clearest thing about settlements is that it requires building and lots of services that needs to get there. And going, for example, in the West Bank, seeing a settlement and in front of it a Palestinian village where the settlement has like half of the popularity of the village and get 2 times more water and electricity. This is something that happens a lot. Second, settlements are they make lots of products. There's factories. There's halva factories or beauty products factories. For example, Aoude, it's a really known label. Code Pink has a big, it's an organization, a women organization in the US that has a campaign against this product specifically because what they do is they actually steal resources from the Dead Sea, resources that belongs to Palestinians, and use them for their products. And this is something that Israel can't give back. Even if we'll evict all the settlements and create a Palestinian state, we can't give back those resources. Gush Katif, for example, which was the big settlement in Gaza, Gaza Strip, had a big industry of flowers and vegetables, who was mainly sell outside of Israel.
Yeah, export.
Export to
there's a lot of interesting information there. So if you go to whoprofits.org, then you can see that. And there's all kinds of other links to it, to human rights organizations like Israeli human rights organization like Tselem and so on. So it's a wonderful website. I checked it out before that. So could you say something more about, for instance, why I want to ask this, because I'm interested in the thing like, you said, as women, for instance, and as Israelis and, members of the human race and peace activists, etc. So it is a multidimensional understanding of what needs to be done to come up with a situation where peace really exists between, for everybody, for Israeli Jews and Palestinians, whether they are Christian, Muslim, what have you. There's this other thing, which is in the imaginary of the West, perhaps that Israel is a Western country. It's Western values and all that kind of stuff. But Netta, you know that most of the Israeli Jews are from Arab countries, right? Well, there you go. Where are you from originally, your parents?
My father is from Morocco.
Morocco.
And my grandfather, other one, is from Iraq.
From
and
Iraq.
I have one grandmother that's from Germany.
Germany, okay. So that's the thing. There's some of the, there's a book called Arab Jews, written by an Israeli, a guy, I forget the name, but he, dedicates the book to his grandmother, who, her name is Arabic name, It's very interesting. He thinks of himself, he talks about himself as an Arab Jew, and he relates stories and all that kind of stuff in it. So it's interesting that a lot of those Arab Jews, or Mizrahim or whatever else other names for it, that they are from the Orient, shall we say, or from the East. So that is something that's not very well known in the West, because they think of Israel as a Western country with Western values, etc. But even if people who are Western have like fundamentalist notions of religion, etc., so it's not related only to Islam or to Buddhist or to Christians, what have you, but also fundamentalist Judaism. You might want to talk about that since you have experiences with those settlers.
The way religious settlers often feel about this issue is, God has given us the entire land belongs to Israel, and to the Jews, and they justify a lot of really terrible things that they do to Palestinians, cutting down their trees, burning their fields, poisoning their water wells, killing either them or their sheep sometimes. All these terrible, terrible acts are justified in their minds because of Jewish values. And I think certainly what Rabbis for Human Rights are trying to do, but also a lot of other people, is to say that there are two different kinds of Judaism. Or there are even more. There are many ways to interpret the holy texts, and there are many ways to see that. I personally don't feel motivated by religious means. I want to say that I work. My activism is not coming from a religious Jewish place. It's coming from a humanitarian point of view, regardless of religion. That's personally. But there are some people who do things on both sides of the spectrum. Pro-occupation or anti-occupation from religious points of view.
Depending upon their interpretation. Of course, we have here in the United States those Christian fundamentalists who actually they are Christian Zionists, and some of them define themselves as Christian Zionists. So they are more Zionist than Christian. And they are just, believe in all this mythology and justify that mythology begins to justify them killing or supporting killing Palestinians, etc. Because Palestinians, even if they are Christian, they are not really true Christian, and so on. So they begins to show you how those kinds of issues begin to close one's mind and allow them to become inhumane in their treatment of the other. You want to say more about that? Like, for instance, what anarchists against the wall are doing? Or you mentioned some things earlier, but more on that, or anything surrounding the questions we are talking about?
First of all, the anarchists against the wall are really not related to anything religious.
Absolutely.
And I feel comfortable being there because of that, because I feel that lots of people are motivated of proving that Judaism is not this, but it's that, and personally I don't like it. Really the big majority of the activity is around the wall and around actual demonstrations against the wall. So, but more than that, we also support the people who were hurt. For example, I think it's important to mention Tristan Anderson, who is an activist from the United States who came to Israel, Palestine actually, and was shot with a gas canister into his head, and now is in the hospital for a long time. And Rachel Corrie, who was an activist who was ran over by a bulldozer.
I saw pictures of Anderson as he was people were trying to give him like first aid and all that kind of stuff. So it's really horrific what happened to him, to Rachel Corrie, and a lot of other people, including of course Palestinians who are like 10,000, 11,000 of them are in jails, Israeli jails, and so forth.
And if I mentioned Billy a few sentences ago, I want to mention Bassem Abu Ahma, who was shot a few months ago in his chest from the same gas canister and was killed. And he was one of the most dedicated to nonviolence activities that I've ever met. And this is something that is important to mention again, the nonviolent struggle, because we really believe in that. And when Maya said before that we go to olive harvest and help Palestinians or protecting them, all those things are nonviolent acts. And it's really important to mention this, especially when we look at the other side and how everything they do is connected to violence, or even if they're not actually violent, then it's a threat, because you always see a person with a gun in front of you, and it's always this to show how nonviolent we are in front of their violence.
Yeah, And that's an excellent point, because people, when they look at Palestinians doing some activity, they think of it as like, suicide bombing and this and that, yeah? But the overwhelming majority of Palestinian activism is non-violent. It's like, you see images of old women like fighting with an young Israeli soldier who has a gun, and she's just with her bare hands, fighting with him, etc. That's one thing. But also, after she gets frustrated because she wants to cross, checkpoint and so on, they give her like all kinds of help for that. But most of the activities are just like non-violent activities and demonstration, and peaceful resistance.
It's important to mention that there is people throw stones, but to see a stone as a weapon in front of a gun, that's, I mean, there are soldiers who were hurt from stones.
Sure.
It's okay to say that, but it's not, you can't compare it.
Absolutely.
You can't compare it to more than 25 people who
or
were
with a Chinook
killed.
helicopter wiping out people,
I think definitely the power disparity between Israel and Palestine regarding weaponry and all this is so huge, and it's often not discussed. And a lot of times you'll hear Israelis bring up, terrorism, parallel to, the army, and it's just not the same thing.
That's right.
It's really not the same kind of power, and Palestinians don't have an army to protect themselves, and this is something you have to take into account.
Right. Yeah. Another thing, like in terms of Gaza, what happened in Gaza last December and this year, in January of this year. People sometimes look at it as, whoa, it's a war or something. But actually, it wasn't a war, because there weren't two, armies fighting or anything. It was just like wiping out a people, basically. And this is the continuation of ethnic cleansing. For instance, Israeli writer, she passed away now in 2007, Tanya Reinhardt, who wrote about the Israel-Palestine, How to End the War of 1948, exposing all those kinds of propaganda materials regarding the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and how like the Israelis blamed, with the Americans supporting them and saying the same thing, blamed the Palestinians for the failure of the negotiations, like in 98, 99, 2000, etc. So Clinton left the White House without achieving anything for the benefit of Israel or the United States. And of course, the Palestinians didn't get anything either. So she exposes all those kinds of machinations and the propaganda that it was the Palestinians' fault that these negotiations have failed. So I think it's important to look at what the Israelis have been doing, rather than arriving at a solution. How can you arrive at a solution when you are still like stealing land on the West Bank?
I think there are two main things here. On one hand, there's really the Israeli hypocrisy of, like you were mentioning, negotiating on the one hand and building settlements and stealing more Palestinian land on the other. That's one issue. And the other issue is also what was actually offered to the Palestinians in these negotiations. Israelis consider them generous, but if you actually look at it, they are not generous at all. Certainly not if you compare it to the UN partition plan in terms of land and what they were granted, but also in terms of autonomy. They weren't granted airspace control. They weren't granted a joint border with Jordan. They weren't granted a lot of control over their natural resources like water, where there's a lot of main settlements on a lot of aquifers. All of these things were not offered to the Palestinians, and that's what makes it not so generous, because it's not really a continuous, viable state. It's little easily controlled islands.
Yeah. What I want to do, since we're talking about the wall, I want to show like a few minutes of a video called The Wall of Hate, and then we can quickly talk about it. We have about 6 minutes left or something.
Occupation is a fluid term that can be easily manipulated by the powerful and occupying powers. When the occupied is portrayed as violent and the occupier as victim, then democracy and justice have to be redefined. If the international community cannot stop Israel's apartheid wall and the destruction of people and their livelihood, then humanity is at stake. In June 2000, and while the international community is pushing to promote freedom and install democracies throughout the Middle East, Israel decides to reinforce its occupation by encircling the West Bank and Palestinian towns with a separation barrier that is meant to choke the Palestinian population and deprive them from their livelihood. Compared to the 96-mile, 11.8 feet high Berlin Wall that was destroyed in 1989, the Israel Separation Wall extends more than 408 miles and reaches between 6 and 24 feet high. It consists of solid concrete in some areas and a 40-meter complex of trenches 6 to 8 feet deep, barbed wires, electronic surveillance fences, and patrol roads in other areas. The wall, which swallows more than 42% of the West Bank, is in most areas not on or near the 1967 Green Line that divides Palestine from Israel. It snakes its path as deep as 10 miles inside the West Bank and encircles cities like Tulkarm and Qalqilia entirely, thus trapping all in its path and separating Palestinians from their families, homes, land, water, and livelihoods.
I want to stop it here just to give us an idea about how long the wall is, etc., so that it won't be like just in our imagination, but see what it means, etc. Any more stuff on that, like you want to say, Netta?
It's important to mention about the security, because people say, well, we do need a wall. So when the bombing started to go down or even stopped, it was 2005.
It was only 40% built at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Clearly, it's not what's stopping the terrorists.
Yeah, right.
and I think this is what's really important to say, because if we wanted the wall to be the security, then we would put it on the Green Line.
Mm-hmm. That's
But
right.
this is now a tool to enforce the ideology.
Yeah, I just want to, we have a lot of stuff to cover and we don't have time to, but I just want to, like, what is your position on the question of peace between Israelis and Palestinians? I mean, how do you imagine this? If it were to happen like by a magic wand, what would be your opinion about it?
Well, I personally, ideally, would want no states. I would want everyone in the world just living sort of independently of states and nationalities and all these other things that divide us. That would be my dream, my utopia. But for now, working realistically on what can be achieved in the near future, I want the occupation to end, and I want the solution to be just, and I want it to be a solution that is acceptable by both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it seems like, it's hard to tell with surveys, and democracy is such a fickle thing, but it seems as though both sides seem to want a two-state solution. And as long as Palestinians, and I stress this, Palestinians are also okay with this, this is something that we can work towards. And this is something the occupation is destroying, the possibility of this right now.
Yeah. Netta, quickly? You agree with that? Yeah. Well, okay, we're flat out of time, but and we have a lot of other things to talk about, so we'll talk more about it later on. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for watching. Mahalo. See you the following month. Aloha.